I wanted to start this conversation about funding opportunities at Algorand and Algorand Foundation, sort of looking at our goal for the end of 2022, which is 2 billion of TVL. And we've done the math. We have some metrics and asks in line. And I think I'm going to try to at least attempt to give you guys kind of an overview of how we're hoping to get there and how you can get there with us. But first, I wanted to kind of give a quick introduction about myself, because I think to some extent, providing a brief background about myself and how this sort of informs our ecosystem at Algorand Foundation is a rather a multifaceted kind of multidisciplinary approach and pipeline of short-term asks, which fund longer-term visions. So I was actually raised for like my life for the last 40 years in 30 seconds, or an attempt to. I was basically raised in a finance family. When I went to school for university, I was in computer science, and then I fell in love with open source collectives while in New York City for grad school specifically. So I spent a lot of my time looking at projects which have high value and high value points of entry, and sort of would reverse engineer those specifically so that they could be open source projects. So these were things like multi-touch systems with rear illumination and open source tracking, computer vision projects, things like fabrication tools and laser cutters, if you're at all familiar with my hardware life. And in parallel, I sort of ended up having an artist career. And I collaborated with people like Google a few years ago doing machine learning, computational art. Chanel and a lot of major companies and museums hold my work in their collections and acquisitions. So when 2019 rolled around, it was like pre-pandemic, which right now feels like a million years ago, especially for those of us who are stuck still in lockdown. NFTs started to sort of gain awareness, I think, within crypto. And specifically, I was approached by a group called Foundations, not Algorand Foundation, but Foundations, which was, at the time, it was on MakerDAO, then moved to ETH, and it stayed on ETH. But I did some advising for them. And then I worked with people like Polkadot and Kusama on their NFT plays before I met Tal Robinson, who was the head of research at the Algorand Foundation. And I fell in love with the way they were thinking about things like post-quantum computing, ironically, which was the talk right before me, and kind of how they were thinking about blockchain and use cases that were future facing versus sort of what just worked now. And I really felt that that was a long-term solution, and in addition to sort of interoperability and a lot of other plays that I've been quite interested in. So now that I'm here, I'm technically the head of ecosystems and technical operations, but I do everything from looking at NFT plays and interoperability, bridges, to working with artists, curators, collectors, gallerists, venture capitalists on sort of what's viable on chain from a technical standpoint, a social standpoint, a business development standpoint, like everything all in between. It's like Lucky Charms cereal. It's just the rainbow of colors. So if you don't already know much about Algorand Foundation, we are basically a global decentralized foundation whose core mission is to foster and accelerate the mass adoption of Algorand protocol across multiple verticals. So I like to kind of define these verticals as key spaces in which we focus our growth. So this could be something as specific as, or as vague as developer acquisitions and onboarding ecosystems and research, such as the recent work of Algorand Foundation researchers, which has recently been implemented by Facebook for WhatsApp key registration, actually allowing the ability to later secure retrieval utilization through something called the opaque protocol, which they built. Shout out to Hugo if you're listening online. In addition to things like governance, which I believe our CEO, Sean, will be discussing tomorrow at his keynote in the morning. So I'll kind of leave that out of the scope and focus specifically, since I know you're all here to talk about funding. So this is sort of how I like to view it from a macro perspective in terms of the lifespan of our funding cycles and sort of how we approach funding from a systemic sort of ecosystem approach. So we see this as a multi-tiered approach, starting with on the left here, maybe on the right for you, I'm not sure, hacks. And I define that as things like hackathons and university engagement. These are essentially more prescriptive things where we reach out to things like engineering students or people who are in computer science or MBA programs who are sort of what I like to dub blockchain curious, and allows you to sort of get a feel of how our SDKs work, how it feels to work with TiTeal, work with things like Reach, and sort of giving them like I call it the hello world approach to building a blockchain. From there, the idea is that you go into bounties, which we recently released on Gitcoin. So right now we've had about over 500,000, I believe, in funding distributed across bounties. And bounties are typically created as community needs, community developer driven, things that people in Discord keep asking for, things that the foundation developers on my team kind of recognize as needs for developers. And then things like NFT marketplaces or NFT plays or ARC parameters, and sort of looking at these kind of, I don't want to say low hanging fruit, but things that you can do quickly within a few months, maybe, to longer term kind of bigger pictures like AVM compliance and compatibility across chains. And those are specifically usually delineated in algo. And then from there, it's like it keeps growing and growing. So with grants, grants is its own beast. We have, how do I start with grants? We kind of look at grants from like, I guess, the idea that you come out of it or you start with it with sort of an MVP, which can roll into the accelerators. So grants specifically are something that I'll get into in the next slide. But from there, then you can go into the accelerators, and from accelerators, I work with key VC partners to sort of do the due diligence and look at the on-chain viability before getting you into series and seed funding. So it's really like about creating this whole lifespan cycle of funding opportunities for people that are interested or developing on Algorand in the blockchain to sort of really accelerate and aid in sort of the funding realities that I think exist for anyone who's working within the space. So specifically to cover grants, that's kind of the main, I think, funnel we have right now for funding. With grants, the Algo Fund currently is around 500 million USD. This is a decentralized development which offers undiluted funding, meaning that we'd never take equity, at least yet, to projects which are building out on Algorand with on-chain functionality specifically. So due to the acceleration of applications also, I should probably note, we have recently kind of further defined the opportunity cycle to reflect the demands and expectations of that growth. So we have more recently been looking at development areas such as applications, utilities, monitoring, API tooling, libraries, NFT plays. I'm really big on interoperability. I know that Paul spoke about that recently in his talk, but I kind of see interoperability as like allowing blockchains to interact in a way that we remove that silo and really create sort of mechanisms and spaces in which the notion of sort of one space or one successor is essentially diluted. And then we look at things like, more recently, we've done a lot with NFT plays. So NFT is what I'm kind of my specialty is, I guess I say. And we're looking at right now more complex NFTs. So I call these NFTs 2.0, or I think as Chris at Reach says, he calls them smart NFTs, which I think is also a nice kind of way to do that. It's really taking the baseline NFTs, which is what I think we're seeing like propagating within the systems and in marketplaces right now, and creating more complex parameters and integrations in which leverage things like upcoming bridges, gaming, physical assets, and sort of looking at, I think, the ROIs as a more complex mechanism and sort of the current, what I would call like read-only NFTs. And then finally, we have things like social good. So that's something where the ROIs, I think, are quite separate from the rest of the metrics for success. And they tend to be more nuanced, more global thinking, and more long-term. And then finally, what I call, or I've dubbed Web 4. So these are people and groups thinking beyond Web 3 into things like post-quantum computation, AR, fiducial integration, or DIDs, for example. So recently we launched a grant page as well. I wanted to give a shout out to Steve if he's listening, and Ronan and Alan, if you want to get a more macro view of sort of what we've recently launched in the last year and a half since the Algorand 500 million USD, 250 million Algo Fund was launched. And then if you've been following the ecosystem, basically in the early half of 2021, we quickly realized that we needed something more prescriptive and specific to target in terms of DeFi. And as I'm big on interoperability, I kind of believe that the most successful blockchains will be those which do not operate in silos. So we launched the DeFi fund specifically about looking at how we could build a long-term DeFi application and required, we felt that the long-term build out of really advanced DeFi applications would basically entail sort of a significant commitment in terms of software development, engineering, ecosystems, building, so on and so forth. So a DeFi developer, we wanted to make them come in and feel like they really could be confident and feel embraced in terms of being able to build on Algorand, and that they had the ability to grow and scale and never have to worry about downtime. So since that's what the Algorand blockchain obviously has been built for and kind of designed with in mind, we felt that DeFi was a really obvious play that wasn't being utilized. So with that, we wanted to bring in the volumes of things that we could basically leverage on this interoperability play. And we've had things like bridges coming out. So in the next 2 to 3 months, we have bidirectional bridges coming out with DOT, Bitcoin, ETH, Solana, Binance, more ETH in the coming months and weeks. And we also have some key Oracle plays coming out in parallel. So we think that this will create, or we hope that it will create, a massive TVL wave to Algorand, because it finally gives people that opportunity to kind of exist outside of the silos of other layer ones. So I have 15 minutes. I'm trying to go as quickly as I can. And finally, I want to give you guys a really high-level overview to kind of get an opportunity to look at what is building out and being built out in our ecosystem for 2022. So specifically, the ACE, which is the Algorand Center for Excellence program, will be launching its cohort with the idea that it's building and running multidisciplinary centers which advance research and applied global blockchain education across cryptocurrency, and specifically in universities and things like research institutes worldwide. We also have multiple developer certification programs launching. So end of Q4, early Q1, with a multitude of developer roadshows, or as I like to call them, road trips in 2022. Depending on the COVID situation, we're hoping to be across Europe, Asia, and the US. With additional events, I think that will be forming around ACE and the recent Formula E sponsorships. Finally, I see our grants as sort of the endpoint of this pipeline, which then rolls into the roadmap pipeline for Accelerator AS. Right now, we have confirmed accelerators going on in Europe and Asia, with potential new and additional build-outs in Europe and the US as well. So we have a kind of trying to hit every single sector and vertical as we can next year, as aggressively as we can. And yeah, I think we're here to play and we're here to win. And I want to invite you all to reach out to me on social if you have any questions or feedback. Unfortunately, I have not been able to get to Miami due to the hard lockdowns here in Austria. So I've very much look forward to speaking and talking and meeting you all after being online for the last 2 years. But unfortunately, I'm still going to have to exist on the screen. So if you want to reach out to me, my email address is here, my Twitter and Instagram are there. If you want to ask any questions or have me look at decks or need links or questions about kind of funding options, technical implementations, whatever, I'm here and I'm happy to chat as long as I can't go anywhere in front of my screen. So I'm over my time limit, but I wanted to thank you all for listening, and I hope Miami's amazing, and I look forward to lots of pictures and stories.